I'm John Geer, and this is The Choice, podcast dedicated to discussing the 2024 election with my friend Jon Meacham.
I'm Jon Meacham. I'm here to take care of John Geer, who's having some fashion issues with his jacket, which we were in class a little while ago, and I had a picture of Ted Knight from the Mary Tyler Moore Show on screen to bring cultural literacy of the 1970s to the youth of Vanderbilt.
Yes, and I have to say that this jacket, which was chosen by my wife, I would say the fact that John has a problem with it suggests to me that I'm on the cutting edge. And so, but here we are to talk about the 2024 race. And John, you kind of proposed this idea last spring. And kind of what was the motivations behind it?
Well, as you may recall, we did this in 2020, and I got an unusual amount of reaction to it. And what struck me about that was, though there is this tsunami of opinion and information and perspective on politics, there's not a whole lot of, dare I say it, and I'm setting the bar high for us, a kind of civilized conversation where, to use your point, there's actual evidence involved. And I just thought, given Vanderbilt's remarkable place in the culture as a place, I describe Vanderbilt undergraduates as sharp but not sharp-elbowed. And so let's see if we can at least try to be as good as they are.
That's right. I mean, this is, John and I, along with Josh Clinton and Nikki Hemmer, teaching 1,100 students this semester in Langford Auditorium. It's great fun, but the students themselves are all there to learn. And in fact, one of the things, we did a class survey, and it turns out nearly all of them believe that Joe Biden won the election, that there wasn't many who think that Biden actually lost the election, that it was stolen from Donald Trump. And that's important, and not as a partisan point of view, but playing off on what John just said, is that our commitment, and when I say our, it's not just myself or Professor Meacham, but it's the university's commitment as well, is we have to be committed to evidence. That we're not committed to ideology, because if you let ideology be your guidepost, you're going to be wrong about half the time. But if you let evidence be your guidepost, you're not going to be right all the time, but you're going to be right at a higher proportion of the time. And that's really critical. And it also then allows you to have a conversation that isn't filled with attacks and accusations, but rather one that seeks to advance the conversation, to let people know what this choice that we face in 2024 is all about.
Yeah. Well, to jump right in, I mean, we if we had been here on the 4th of July, it would be a very different conversation. It would have been a very different conversation than it is here on the eve of Labor Day. And we really haven't seen, since 1968, a presidential campaign where the structure was as fundamentally altered as it has been in 2024. Going into June 27th, President Biden was facing off against former President Trump. It seemed that was the reality of the campaign, and now it's not. And I think President Trump's had a hard time adjusting to that so far. But my own view of what happened in the debate in Atlanta and in President Biden's ultimate decision is that fate and history brought Joe Biden to the pinnacle of power at a very late season in his life. And he's my friend. I help him when I can. But I'm not a Democrat. And there are policy issues on which I disagree with the president. That said, I believe he's a constitutionalist. I believe that he is fundamentally devoted to the rule of law and the building of consensus that would enable a very complicated, disputatious democratic republic to continue to survive and maybe even thrive. And he recognized the political and actuarial reality. and I think made a very difficult and ultimately noble decision to stand aside. And it's, 90 days to go, 95 days to go. Right now, it looks as though if you are standing in President Biden's shoes, it was the right decision. To me, the choice the country faces is less about policy and more about temperament and devotion to a constitutional order. And that seems sort of upper middle brow. I'm not going to say highbrow, but upper middle brow. But I believe it. And I think that what the stakes are, do you want someone who is devoted to an experiment toward a more perfect union? Or do you want someone who has shown that he's willing to put his own interests ahead of the Constitution? And I don't want to say it's not that it's simple, but it is straightforward.
Yeah, and I think this is under normal conditions where you weren't talking about the stakes of the Constitution, so to speak. If Biden was struggling, or whoever the nominee would have been in similar situations, it would have happened. The person would have lost, and you would have had the next person, in this case, the Republican nominee, become president. That wouldn't have been a problem because while the policies might not be ideal, there wasn't any threat to the foundations of the country. And again, for some people that sounds partisan, but that's not designed to be partisan. It's, again, this commitment to the rule of law. It's commitment to evidence that we absolutely have to be driven by. And I think my concern for the country, and this is why the choice matters so much, isn't an ideological one. It's the fact that we have become untethered to evidence, that you can't have a functioning democracy without both sides showing some fidelity to the evidentiary base. They should be able to spin it their way. That is, the Democrats want to talk about job growth. They want to talk about net income. They don't want to talk about inflation. Why? Because that's a story that doesn't help them. So they get to spin it one way. The Republicans should be able to talk about it in another way. But instead, what we're facing is a set of claims that just aren't empirically accurate. Biden's had more job growth, for example, than did when Trump was president. That's just true. Crime rates are down, but yet that's not necessarily the rhetoric. And so I worry, not from a policy point of view, because I myself, very much like Professor Meacham, I'm a raging moderate. I am, not on the left side of the spectrum or the right side of the spectrum. And I also know, and I take a page from Howard Baker, our esteemed former senator from Tennessee, that both sides can be right at a particular point in time, and we need to recognize that, and we need to be faithful to the evidence. And that's why this choice matters so much, why this election matters. And when you think about this election compared to lots of other previous elections, every candidate will tell you this is the most important election of a generation. This is going to be arguably one of the 2 or 3 most important elections in American history, period. So it's not just for this generation, but it's for the broader time of American history, which is, well over 240 years at this stage. So it's important.
Yeah, 1800 was the first transfer of power from one party to another when Jefferson succeeded John Adams. 1828, well, I'd say 1824 was vital in that Andrew Jackson wins the popular vote, wins a plurality in the Electoral College, but not a decisive number, so it goes to the House of Representatives. Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams strike a agreement. Totally fine, by the way. Nothing wrong with that, unless you're Jackson, who did hashtag it. He called it #corruptbargain. But to me, one of the most fascinating things about 1824, particularly in a world where the 45th president is often compared to Andrew Jackson, it never occurred to Jackson to send a mob to the Capitol in 1825 in that winter. He came back to Nashville. He ran again. He obeyed the customs remarkably so, because you're only talking about 35 years or so of experience at that point. And then he wins, of course, in 1828. 1860, 1864, vital elections for all the obvious reasons. I would argue we then kind of zip ahead a bit to 1932. Governor Roosevelt at that time defeats President Hoover. 1948 is fascinating because you have four candidates representing really the whole spectrum of American politics. You have a traditional Republican in Thomas Dewey. You have a traditional Democrat in Harry Truman. You have the segregationist Dixiecrats in Strom Thurmond, and the progressives in Henry Wallace. And Truman narrowly wins that. 1952 is vital, at least heading into the general election, because the reason Dwight Eisenhower ran for president in 1952, having resisted importunings from both parties to become president as early as 1948, was because Robert Taft, the then frontrunner for the Republican nomination, refused to agree to support NATO. And Eisenhower believed, and we have to credit this, because if he had simply wanted to be president, he would already have been president. He was perfectly willing to stay at Columbia. He was president of Columbia University, go to Augusta and play golf. You know, he was living his best life, as we say now. But Taft wouldn't commit to collective security. And Eisenhower was always fully aware, I think nobly so, that his fame had been purchased by the blood of others. And the notion that the legacy of World War II would simply have been a few years as a caesura between the Second World War and a Third World War was something he could not abide. And so he wins in 1952. Parenthetically, we also wouldn't have gotten the Warren Court without Eisenhower winning, because Stevenson would never have appointed Earl Warren to be the Chief Justice. 1960 is vital in retrospect, less so in real time. There's a great story about Dean Acheson writing a note after the first debate between Kennedy and Nixon to Bob Lovett, I think, saying, "These two bore the hell out of me," because so many people saw them as kind of interchangeable World War II younger officers. 68 is vital, obviously, because Nixon emerging from the chaos of that year was probably the last severe stress test of the constitutional order we're talking about. And to his credit, I think, Nixon largely governed from the center. And when he broke the law, he had a sense of shame and followed the law. 2000, so much of what's happened in the 21st century would have been different if Vice President Gore had become President Gore. And 2016 is clearly one of the great inflection elections, as is 2020. And I would argue that we have to view 2024 as the third part of a trilogy that starts in 2016. And we won't really know the end of that story or even the middle of that story until we know who wins this year.
Yeah, no, that's right. This is a story that is yet to be fully written. You know, I think back on all these campaigns, and they're all really important. One of the things that I've been trying to think about, and I know you have as well, is, you know, the 2024 election, the electoral map has been shaken up. All of a sudden now, Kamala Harris has a couple of paths to winning the Electoral College, and really Trump only has one path. He has to puncture the blue wall, the states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin if he's going to win. He's not going to win the popular vote. He's basically gotten about 46%, maybe 46.5% in the last two elections. He's unlikely to do a lot better in this next one. But because of the way the colleges work, he could potentially win if he manages to eke out narrow victories. But the last time that we saw a big shake-up of the poll standings of this kind of magnitude was 1992. And it's worth thinking a little bit about that campaign, not because it was It was critical in the sense of shaping policy. Of course, it did, but the stakes weren't nearly as high as we're talking about in 2024. But people have to be reminded that at the start of the summer in 1992, Bill Clinton was third in the national polls. Ross Perot was neck and neck with then Vice President Bush, who was going to get the Republican nomination. It looked like Perot might just win.
President Bush. 92.
Yeah, right. I'm sorry. President Bush misspoke. President Bush and Ross Perot were neck and neck. It was quite possible for Perot to win at that point in time. And Clinton was almost an afterthought. He was struggling. He had problems with his own personal record. There were lots of problems. And then Perot pulls out suddenly. And Clinton has his debate, his convention, nominates Gore. They look young, they look vibrant, and all of a sudden he soars to the leadership of the polls and leads in the polls and never surrenders it and goes on, obviously, to be president. That was a big shakeup. Obviously, it was different than this one because it was a third party was involved, and Ross Perot came back into that race eventually and still managed to get 19% of the vote, which is an amazing testament to Ross Perot, especially when you think about what's just happened with Robert Kennedy. He was falling like a stone and decided to drop out, endorse Trump. People can speculate about that all they want, but most third-party candidates, the real lesson of Kennedy and most third-party candidates is they become a footnote in history for the most part, and that's not true for Ross Perot. He managed to come back and suggested if he hadn't dropped out, maybe he would have won, and that would have been a real change in party politics. But of course, that didn't happen.
Well, obviously, the campaign victory and administration of Donald Trump will be written about and analyzed as long as the American Republic endures, and even after, depending on how things turn out. And in many ways, the roots of this can be traced back to the 90s, both to Ross Perot, who represented this populist. It was an anger, but it was also that makes it more emotional. There is a genuine, rational, evidence-based critique to make of the duopoly of the Republican and Democratic parties, and Perot made that case. So did Pat Buchanan, from a similar but also different perspective. Both understood how to use media. Buchanan was a creature of cable news. Perot understood the power of Larry King. Hugely important moments unfolded on that show, and they tapped into a significant feeling in the country that the two major parties were not commensurate to the challenges of governance. And that's a historical fact. It's an unfolding political fact. One of the things about third-party candidates is sometimes they lose in the short term but win in the long term. And insofar, without personally enlisting Buchanan and Perot with Trump, that third way is an interesting historical phenomenon, because Trump took the third way but used it not to simply make a point, but to take over a party.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the things that I try to think about politics in ways of trying to figure out some what we might call structural forces, and that what was going on in the Republican Party, which I think gave rise to Trump, was this anger that was reflected by people like Pat Buchanan. But it was also true that the Republicans in 2008 and then again in 2012 nominated candidates who were moderates, who were supposed to be able to win the election, and in fact they lost the election. McCain lost against Obama, and then Romney lost against Obama in his re-election bid. That led to real anger, because often what happens is after a kind of a pragmatist moderate loses like McCain, the party activists gain traction, gain excitement, gain money, and they actually capture the nomination in the next round. and they often go down to big defeat. That happened in 1960 after Nixon loses to Kennedy. The activists gain hold and give rise to Goldwater's nomination. Goldwater loses in a massive defeat. Doesn't even get 40% of the vote, loses the Electoral College by massive amounts, and that gave rise back to the pragmatist Nixon. And so you have this going back and forward. But in this case, pragmatists won back-to-back the nomination and lost, creating all kinds of anger that Trump found a way to tap into in a way that most people didn't understand. Jeb Bush, for example, was trying to run the classic kind of campaign that normally would have been quite successful, but it was playing against a backdrop of a lot of anger, and we still see that anger in the country today. And Trump continues to tap into that, and nobody should underestimate the power of that. And that's been a common theme in American politics. There's never been a time when everybody's been happy by any means.
I keep waiting for that to happen.
It's not happening.
When is that going to happen? I think as people look forward to the next 3 months, couple of things to watch, right? You need to watch. One needs to watch where do what we would now think of as most recently as Nikki Haley Republicans. Mm-hmm. What do they do? Are there people who are Republicans or center-right folks who are uncomfortable with Trump? Are they willing to cross the aisle and actually vote for a Democrat, which, as you know better than I do from polarized behavior, is really hard to do? That's one thing. I do know from conversations with people who are never Trump Republicans that after the debate, after President Biden's performance, they could no longer vote for. They said they could no longer vote for President Biden in that head-to-head. Now they claimed prospectively that they could vote for the vice president. Again, whether that becomes, whether that's true or not, I don't know. One of the things about politics, as we know, is it's rather like what Mark Twain said about the evangelist who came to town in Tom Sawyer, who was so good that even Huck Finn was saved until Tuesday. Can you get past Tuesday in many ways for people who, by and large, are closer to a traditional Republican view than a traditional Democratic view. What alters all of this, of course, is this is the most significant election. Let's think this out. Really, I don't want to say ever, so check me on this, where the composition and action of the Supreme Court is as top of mind for potential swing voters as any time I can think of. The backlash against the Warren Court was hugely important, but that tended to drive people out of the Democratic Party into the Republican Party, thereby rendering them unswing voters. This is a little different.
Yeah, I think it is. And it's, the court certainly weighed in lots of different ways, and obviously the famous Gore v. Bush case, but that was after the election.
Yeah.
And so this is playing out. And of course, then the immunity decision that the Supreme Court handed, giving presidents just more authority, is causing lots of consternation in lots of different quarters, just as for the institution itself, regardless of who happens to be the occupant. And so, yeah, this is, it'll be interesting to see, because one of the things we know as political scientists is that partisanship drives choices. And that one of the things that Harris has been able to do is bring home a lot of Democrats who had doubts about Biden. I think at the end of the day, they might have come home anyways, but they came home a lot quicker, a lot faster, because they had a new reason, new sense of excitement. And that's the thing that, can Harris keep this excitement going? And that excitement matters, because if you can get the turnout up in the 2024 election, that will allow her, in fact, to very likely win. But if this enthusiasm fades and turnout does not increase, and especially in those battleground states, especially in the urban areas that are likely, in the suburban or surrounding counties that are likely to have a lot of potential Harris support, she could end up losing. We just don't know, and there's a lot of speculation about that, and we just don't know yet. And even the polls that have come out, we have to give a couple of weeks before results settle down that we really know whether this is going to stick. Yeah, Harris probably gets a bit of a bounce, but how much and how long it lasts, I mean, there's lots of speculation, but not a lot of information.
Let me ask you one question for our community. Polling, assess the validity of this statement, as we say. Polling in the last decade or so has become ever less predictive.
I think the answer is, on average, yes, that's right. That polls have become more problematic because you basically, the core problem that a poll faces is that you have to take the people who answer the poll and use them to generalize to the entire population. But the problem is that people who answer polls are different than people who don't. And so one thing you have to guard about is Harris's increase in support, because people are more excited about Harris and more willing to do polls, whereas they weren't as excited about Biden, and therefore they were less willing to do polls suggesting that, in fact, Trump was ahead, more so than he actually might be. And also just the response rate from polls. 20 years ago, you might have a response rate on telephone polls of about 30, 35%. It's now down to single digits. That's a huge problem. But we know a lot about polling. We, in fact, have on the faculty Josh Clinton, who's an absolute expert on all of these kinds of questions. There are ways to weight them, and you really do. For all of you out there, President Trump makes a comment about the good and bad polls, which is a distinction, is a fair point. Most candidates, whether it be Trump or Harris, they pick the polls that favor them, and that's the ones they talk about. But there are some polls that are just more reliable, the ones that work really hard at the right kinds of weighting schemes to make sure that they're right. And also, if you get some crazy result, you need to treat it just as that, as crazy. And so the polling industry, in 2016, people say polls were wrong. That's not quite right. Because in 2016, if you woke up that morning, that first Tuesday in November, Hillary Clinton was on up about 2 points nationally in all the polling. She won by 2 points. Where the polling went awry was in individual states, that you get lower quality polls, and often in these state polls. And so that's one thing that the polling industry has tried to create, is you're making sure you're doing good polling in Pennsylvania, you're doing good polling in Wisconsin. In 2020, the polls were off quite a bit. There's no debate about that. But again, it was a weighting scheme. One of the things that Donald Trump has done is got a whole group of people to vote that hadn't been voting, and that has messed up polls. But, what I would do with the polling is, one of the things that I think is definitely true is that Harris is in a stronger position now than Biden was 4 weeks ago. I think that's absolutely true. No debate about that. Is it strong enough that she's actually leading and can win? That's where you have to hesitate a little bit. Is she activating younger voters? Is she activating African-American voters? The answer is yes again, but is it going to be enough? And that we really won't know until Election Day, and very likely after Election Day, because the individual states do the counting of the ballots in such weird ways that Arizona results won't be in, for example, for a while. And that's just the nature of the beast. Let's just close and talk maybe for 2 or 3 minutes about our class we're teaching. 1,100 students, largest class ever, elective class at Vanderbilt. There probably were some required classes of Western Civ at one point in time that may have generated higher enrollments, but actually there was no other bigger room, so it would be tied, I guess, because Langford was still the biggest venue. But truth of the matter is that this is an elective. The students are choosing to take it, which I think says a lot about Vanderbilt students. It says a lot about the time, because they realize, we were just contending, this is an important election. They want to hear about what this election means, because they're going to be living with the consequences far longer than you and I will be. And so what struck you about the class so far that you might share with our viewers?
Enormous interest, as you say. Wonderful students. We're 2 or 3 in, I think. So early days, but you can tell from emails, you can tell from the questions we get that there's a level of engagement that is what I would call not bipartisan, but supra-partisan. There's an interest in this as a cultural, political event, and an intellectual curiosity as well as a civic one. to understand as much as they possibly can. And fortunately, Nikki Hemmer and Josh Clinton can do that,
Exactly.
while the two old guys in the Muppet balcony chatter occasionally.
Yeah. This class started out in 1996. It's been offered every 4 years. It was an idea of a now retired faculty member, Bruce Oppenheimer. And it's become kind of an event for the students, which I think is a tribute to them. It's great fun to teach because of the quality of these students and the fact that they care about it. And I think it's just a general statement about Vanderbilt that just makes teaching here just great fun, because these students are here to learn. They're here to engage. They're not here to make partisan statements. I mean, some people have said, do you think there'll be protests in class? And there might be protests about some of the things I say because I'm just not very good some days.
And the wireless is having a hard time.
Wireless is a big issue, that's for sure. Well, it turns out they're taxing the devil out of the system because they're all online, as you might imagine. But it's a real fun to teach these students, and it's an event. I mean, with this kind of size, it has a different feel than other kinds of classes, but we'll bring some great guests in, and we'll continue to give them substantive stuff to think through, because one of the things we commit to them and we expect them to commit to us is this class is not about partisanship. It's not about voting for Trump or voting for Harris. It's really about figuring out how elections in this country work and also how they don't work. So I think with that, I'm going to close this first conversation of the choice. There's going to be another one in about a month and then a couple after that. I'm John Geer, and
I'm Jon Meacham. I'm the one in the blue jacket, as opposed to Caddyshack chic.
You got it.
John Geer.
I prefer to make a statement, and since I
we
don't have a lot
we,
to say, I've
we
got to
don't
let my
necessarily
jacket
want to
say
hear
it.
that statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much.